Welcome to Fatigue Index, where I have a very kind guest spending his afternoon with me today. Athol, can you welcome, and can you give us a little tiny outline of what of your background? We're talking to football fans here, so this isn't a pacey performance chatting to other techs.
Hi Simon. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I am a podiatrist by trade, who is someone who deals with foot and ankle and lower limb injuries. And I've gone on to do a PhD in biomechanics, which is just how people move and how they interact with the surfaces they play on. And I work at a sports medicine hospital out in Doha, Qatar. So I've just been involved in the delivery of services for the World Cup for the men that have just happened in 2022. And I focus on, I guess, keeping players comfortable in the football boots that they use and keeping them happy that they can perform how they want to without hopefully having too much discomfort. And I'm often called in when there's kind of nasty or career-threatening injuries to top players to help out where I can.
Yeah, so he's underselling himself slightly here, but sports injury hospital in Doha is one of the world's preeminent places to get treatment, and he's the expert. So this is as good as it gets in this realm. Also, there is a couple of relatively famous studies in our world of sports science about footwear and about traction of said footwear in a football context. And for people that have listened to the series on that we're doing on ACL in women's sport, there are a couple of questions that have popped up, but one of them from a study done by St Mary's that came out about the differences between men and women's football boots. Can you talk about that for a second?
There's not a lot of data on it, to be honest. I mean, that's why I think Dr. Katrine Ockham-Krieger from St Mary's, who's now also joined FIFA, is really working away on that space. There's some studies that have looked in the past at foot shape differences. So just, how does the shape of a woman differ from the shape of men's feet? But that wasn't specific to football. I've just helped Kat out with a study across, I think it was 16 teams at like Champions League level, of which there was a lot of international players. I cast my mind back when we visited Wolfsburg. I think there was 8 of the current national team for Germany there that we got to chat to and provide questionnaires for, that asked them about what they think of football boots, what they like, don't like, what experiences they've had. And we also took 3D scans of their feet to develop a kind of database of a snapshot, if you like, of what professional women and international women standard football players' feet look like right now. And I think that was 350 players or so. We scanned both feet, so 700 odd scans. And really, we kind of developed this database and had to scale them so we could look across them at how they differ. And of course, it's going to be the same as men or adolescents or youth. There's going to be variability there. Like there's not going to be this like one perfect foot that professional players used to play football with. But so it was interesting just to get that snapshot and say, well, this is a variation that exists. And if you look at that data, it kind of naturally, almost, if you looked at all the data points from that study of how feet look, the shape of them, it naturally almost turned into 2 subgroups. So one almost wider in the front of their foot, their forefoot, if you like, around where the big toe is, a little higher in the arch, and the other a little lower and a little bit of different shape at their heel. So it kind of formed these 2 groups. So I guess thinking pragmatically, like, should there probably in the future be more than one solution in terms of a woman's line of football boots? Like, coming up with one is a great start, driven by data, which some of the companies are starting to do. But when you look at these groups from this one study, already you can see, well, some are wider and some are narrower and some are higher. Of course, it's just human variability. So probably at least having 2 lines of, women's football boots that fit into these clusters would be a great start. And I understand why that doesn't always happen. Like when you make, tools to build a line of football boots at a massive company that'll cost money, and they make a run of those. So then suddenly having two widths or two different shapes doubles that money, and there has to be then the the sales to pay for that. So we'll see if that's somewhere it goes. We're in a time where I think eventually there's a lot of buzz on around 3D printing and things and kind of bespoke solutions. And I think at an elite level, that's possibly where we'll get to at some stage, like literally 3D scan of your foot, design, and then the corresponding kind of, stud plate or fit. But we're still actually, believe it or not, a little way away from that. It takes a long time to print. The materials can be a little bit not just suitable for the wear and tear of, football boots get wet from the sprinklers that on the surface they get stood on. They're I've often said that the Swiss Army knife of sporting equipment. You need to run, jump, backpedal, walk, hit a ball, feel the ball through the upper of the shoe. So we're not quite there yet.
That's really interesting. I've got a couple of questions that I didn't expect going along with that. So let's talk. Traditionally, we have males' boots. So, but with those males' boots, I have two kids myself, and one of them has really wide forefoot, and one of them doesn't. A typical standard for a foot. And so he gets to always have one type of Nike boot, even though the other type is the one he likes best, but he can't fit his foot in there. And so like we already have traditionally, like a Magista is one width, and then a Mercurial is always another width. And it's kind of standard. People know this if they've had experience of repeatedly buying boots each season. And apart from 3 years ago, they completely swapped them over, which was a little bit confusing. But then you'll get some kind of Adidas that's traditionally always narrow, and then another one that's always wide. What other differences do we have beyond that you're finding in women's that so you can't just categorize them as they fit within this group because of their structure of their foot, and so you get them they've got wide feet like a wide fit like a 15-year-old boy. So we get them a Magista, and if they've got narrow feet, you put them in the Mercurial. Does that make sense?
Yes. So what differences in terms of boots? Yeah, it's absolutely great if you have some knowledge over that, especially at youth level or children's level, because eventually if they're very good at football, they might end up in contracts with manufacturers. And if you are able to help out in steering them into a probably a silo of a manufacturer, more than one manufacturer, because to be honest, across manufacturers now, there's probably similar silos. Like if you look at Adidas, you'll have an out and out kind of striker performance boot. You'll have an out and out, which almost midfield defender boot, and something that the goalkeepers prefer to wear. And that's the same with Nike, and same with Mizuno, and same with Puma. They sort of have these lines for which you probably find some that fit differently. And there are the subtle differences in shape. So I think with kids, a really easy way to start, even just or women or youth, is like take the insole out of the boot, put it on the floor, and stand on top of it. Like if your foot is like spilling over it width-wise, its shape is different. You'll find some of them insole-wise are just shaped a little differently. Like if you look at a Puma Future or an Ultra against a Mercurial, they're all just got these subtle differences, and some of them will just suit you a little better, and that will come through as a feeling of comfort. You have this kind of, we've really, really clever kind of musculoskeletal systems, and when something fits, it's almost like kind of, it's kind of like being in the flow. I don't know if you've gone snowboarding or mountain biking and everything's feeling good, or you hear about, best football players and the best rugby number 10s, when everything works. And that's sort of how it should feel when your boots are right for you. I think this kind of this train of thought that we still have to buy them super, super small and wear them in, and they should be painful initially, I think we'll hopefully move on from that a little bit as there's more options in terms of subtle fit differences. Now, people still love to wear them tight. There's no doubt about that. They want to feel the ball. But I think if you can find those subtle shape differences, and that might be some of them feel a bit deeper than others, some of them are a bit wider, some just have a different shape through the arch or the forefoot or the heel. The heel in particular can be a problematic area, especially with youth. We've done some studies with elite well, it was male academies at this time, and really problems around the heel was a massive issue. Players trying to adjust them and alter them, and that actually came out in the European Clubs Association study that will be released soon as well. Like I think 1/3 of the women across those 16 clubs, 1/3 of them reported problems around their heel area. Yeah, so
that's interesting.
Yes, the long and the short of it, I think, especially at a younger age, before you're contracted and tied in, is trying to find that kind of, that subtle little shape that works for you. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great insight in the first place, getting the sole out and trying it out, because it makes so much sense, and I'd never thought of it myself.
That's one way to just start to at least, tune it in a little bit, the fit. Yeah. And then of course from there comes you mentioned earlier, the traction, the different stud types, and you've been around youth sport long enough to know that some of the surfaces can be great, and some of the surfaces can probably not have enough funding for maintenance, or haven't been looked after as well, or are really high usage, and they're not so great. So there's decisions to be made there, which aren't always easy as a parent or a player that hasn't access to endless money and can buy endless amounts of shoes. So I think if I was to give some pragmatic advice there, with my medical hat on, I would just kind of like to see enough traction for people to be able to play the match and not slip over. They can accelerate, decelerate, and perform. But I would always err, especially with younger players, on a boot that releases from the surface in a rotational manner a little easier. So getting your foot stuck on a surface and then your knee rotating above it or something is a bit of a disaster. It's certainly not the only reason you get a lower limb injury or you get an ACL injury, say, but it's one of the sort of slightly modifiable reasons that might contribute. So what I'm talking about there is, like, people know this, but just the length of studs, the differences between something that you'd wear for a very muddy type, slippery surface compared to something that has been tuned to play on an artificial surface. So lots of small round studs will really spread the pressure out onto your foot, but it will also release a little easier. So as long as you're not slipping. So that's the kind of, for me now, that's become the outsole or stud of choice for youth athletes that are playing on really high friction artificial surfaces. So artificial pitches that haven't been maintained very well. So all the fibers have fallen over. There's not much rubber crumb left. They're pretty firm. Then we'd be trying to look for shoes like that, smaller round studs and lots of them. Whereas, really, really muddy, awful waterlogged pitch, then of course that's just not going to work. So the trick to it really is trying to figure out if a surface is very high friction already, like it's already pretty kind of sticky, if you like, or there's a chance of there's a lot of grip, wheels are really high traction, then we probably don't want to marry up a really high traction shoe with that, because we're kind of adding two things together then that lead to a situation we might not like. And on the other extreme, if it's a really slippery surface and we add a lower traction shoe, then we're just going to slip over, and the game will be terrible as a spectacle. So trying to find something in the middle. I mean, that's probably your world as well, isn't it? It's the Goldilocks, too much, too little, just right. And that's what you're looking for.
But but traditionally you would go, I don't know, you would as a footballer, when I was a kid, we're inventing new boots, and you get a different type of stud, and like, wow, this is amazing. Look how much this sticks. How awesome is that?
Yeah.
But what you're suggesting, if I'm reading it right, is that we need to go on the opposite end of that continuum and look at trainers and go, right, these aren't enough traction on this surface, so can I get the next level of traction along from there?
Yeah, probably I would hate to see it swing all the way the other way. Like, yeah, it shouldn't be, nanny state type stuff and everyone must wear these super short studs, and because it just won't be for everyone. You're never going to have goalkeepers and defenders probably that, because if they slip over, the match changes. So
can I preface this by girls football is almost exclusively played on AstroTurf.
Mm-hmm.
So in England, particularly, the pathway works. They play only on AstroTurf in the academy setups. And then I would say maybe twice a season they'll play on grass, and they hate it. And then they get to play on grass when they turn professional. and
Yeah.
go in the top echelons of the WSL, because the championship even mostly is on AstroTurf. And you imagine the quality difference from one place to another as well. It's huge. So they can be playing on rolled carpet in some places, and on beautiful 2-inch deep 4G with total rubber covering on others. So it's always Astro.
I mean, imagine how that sort of shifts your movement strategies, like even the way the ball zips on the surface, the ball surface interaction, and then that slightly changes your movement strategies and probably even the way you attack the game, whether there's more short passes or over the top stuff. Like, things shift because of the way the surface is put together. There'll be less slide tackles on certain surfaces because you just think, I'm not doing that, So it's interesting how that shifts. In the past, getting smaller studs like this sort of thing were on a kind of like the little nubbed ones, the little trainers that have all these little nubs in them and they have some cushioning. So they're kind of called turf shoes. Nobody plays them. They don't like them at elite level. They just don't yet. So now, at least, if you are you're a Nike Tempo or you are a Puma Future One or whatever, you'll find they'll have those outsoles available in the elite boot or in a decent boot. So you don't have to kind of, I guess, take a lower quality material or a boot to have that. You can have that now in the exact same boot that you have, just in different options. And I think that's something we're pushing, especially for training on artificial surfaces. I have some of the most expensive players in the world that have passed through here with foot problems, that we change their outsoles to AG or artificial type outsoles. So when you see their boots, they just look like the normal boots, and they're playing at the highest level in these most of the time, unless the pitch is slippery. But the caveat to that is the surfaces they're playing on are unbelievably maintained. Like any of the Premier League surfaces or PSG surface, or these surfaces are hybrid reinforced, so they have these kind of little bits of plastic stitched into them. They're sand based. They're perfect. So that's the difference.
So I've talked not with you obviously today, but on previous episodes about the mechanism of ACL injury and the things that cause it structurally, from an intrinsic, from the body's perspective. And what you've covered here is how the interaction between the sole of the boot and the surface. Can you give us some more insight into how that affects the potential risks? So more traction, less traction, what increases the risk?
So firstly, I'll definitely get to that. Firstly, there's very little hardcore data on this. Like, when you really want to do a deep dive in the research world, there's good data on this in American football, where they've taken, football shoes out, loaded them onto artificial machines, twisted them to measure the torque, which is how much force does it take for the boot to release from the surface. And then also looked at injury rate and found, if you have a very high number for the boot releasing from the surface, there was more injuries and they were more severe. So that's over a few American football studies, European handball, Finnish floorball, which I'd never heard of before. So there's a few sports in the world where they're making this kind of link between too much traction and ACL injury risk, or ankle syndesmosis, like rotational ankle injury or ACL. But there isn't any in football, which is what we've been working on. There certainly isn't any in women's football yet. So I've done a lot of work where I've taken those mechanical machines. So we take an artificial foot, we load a boot onto it with a certain stud type, whether it be, these metal ones or blades or shorter ones. And we then rotate it on the grass and see how much force to release it. And we'll keep moving all over the pitch, because pitches are not uniform. So we go to all different areas and we get numbers. And that's been interesting, but I mean, it's a machine. It doesn't move like a human. It kind of gives us a way to benchmark where those shoes sit for that surface. So almost like if you were a groundsman and you took a tool out and you measured something, well, it gives you some information, but it doesn't move like a person. So it's kind of one part of the puzzle. And then the rest of it is yet to be done, can you believe, in 2023 in football that generates so much revenue. there just isn't that data there yet, and we've been working on that. But back to the mechanism. You can't really, so if you think about any way to produce force, if you think about a golf swing, a lot of the force is correlated. So like the club head speed is correlated to how much force you push through your feet. Really, most things are generated through that interaction between shoe and surface. So if you're on a very icy surface, you're not going to rupture your ACL if you do a sidestep, because you can't get the grip. So then you can't generate force. So you need a certain amount of friction or traction to almost resist movement so that you can push off it. And that can be straight line, linear, it can be rotational. There's obviously 3 dimensions. And so with football and the surface, being penetratable, that you have these studs that go into the surface. Hopefully the studs sink pretty much, or the blades or whatever it is, sink pretty much to the stud plate. And then that gives you that kind of that grip, that traction to be able to then push off and turn. So that's why we see incredible, decelerations and change the direction and accelerations and things. So too much has been correlated with more severe injuries and more of them. Too little, you slip over. So somewhere in the middle is a sweet spot. So in saying that, it seems there's 2 different components of traction. So the higher we can get the straight line traction seems to be okay. So if we can tune the properties of a surface, or the properties of the studs, the way that they're orientated, the way that they shaped, how long they are, their position on the shoe, like where they should sit, and we can then get that really good acceleration, deceleration in a straight line or side to side, but they rotate a little easier. That's kind of the golden, that's where we're trying to get to. And that's what a lot of companies are chasing.
That it makes a ton of sense. Can you explain really how the continuum, how the difference in friction, difference in quality of surface from say the 4G pitch, the indoor 4G pitch you've got at Aspire, versus let's say a 15-year-old carpet. So what would have been a 2G pitch with sand on that you might get at a local leisure centre, or both of which are very much used by girls' football teams in the same season?
Yeah, I mean, there is pretty good evidence for some of the earlier generations of artificial pitch being more hazardous in terms of injury risk. There's no doubt about it. They just had higher friction coefficients. They had so basically that they had higher resistance to your foot being able to release, so it would get stuck. I think that's becoming a little better, especially some of the surfaces with slightly longer fibers and lots of rubber crumb. They seem to release a little easier. So there's definitely a difference there. But knowing that there are leagues that will play across all of those, that's really difficult, especially if you don't have, it's fine if you are at an elite football club that has a kit man or woman who also can supply you with all these different types of outsole options. It's a bit more difficult when it's kind of mum and dad that are supplying those boots, and maybe, boots are not cheap, and then having those different options, because the only way really to change the friction you're experiencing on those 2 extremes is to change your shoes. Like, you can change your movement strategies a bit, which probably naturally happens, but it's really to tune in the shoes.
So would your advice be on the carpet version to be smaller?
Absolutely.
And a longer stud on the grass version?
Shorter, round, and lots of them, and round at the heel as well if you can. So some of them you'll see they'll be round at the front, but there'll be blades at the back. To be honest, if it's a really tight carpet version with super high friction, those sand type ones you're talking about, small, round, and lots of them. Probably really trying to avoid large blades on those surfaces. Like, there's a place for these. They really improve slalom type performance, curve run type performance, but that has to be on a grass pitch where they'll release. And then absolutely not on that sort of pitch for this. And the main reason being they just won't penetrate properly. So you can get 2 ends of the spectrum there. You can either get an area where they don't penetrate at all and you're kind of almost standing above the surface. Like, if you put them on in a changing room that's got a concrete floor, you feel a bit unstable because your studs are, and you feel a lot of pressure under each of those studs because there might only be 4 at the front and 2 at the back. so that the forces are not spread out very evenly. You can imagine force is really evenly spread out here because there's so many contact points, whereas here it's not. So the big problem is the studs don't penetrate all the way, which leaves you a little bit more open to going over on your ankle or feeling lots of pressure through the plates. Or you have this kind of poorly maintained pitch where there's a really hard part and then the next step's a softer part, and then they'll penetrate all the way and you'll get traction differences. So you'll have, if they don't penetrate, you'll have not much traction at all and you could slip. And then if they do penetrate, you'll have a heap of traction. And I think if anything, we humans are pretty clever. They can within a step or two figure out different surfaces, but with cognitive loads, players pressing, balls coming, tasks, that's a lot to compute. So I think if we could have the ideal kind of scenario is whether a pitch is hard or soft or whatever, that it is uniform.
Yeah. So one of the risk causes of, I don't know, one of the most common identifications of a movement that causes ACL is uncontrolled landing. So contact in the air, which tends to cause a girl to land in a slightly different direction or at a slightly different time than their brain was ready for, than they were expecting. So they might break 100th of a second later than they needed to, or they expected. And so am I right in thinking that with those bigger studs that you were just showing there on a sandy surface, that though you're above the ground, occasionally one of those studs is going to get through, so that your brain has taken 6 steps with it on top of the surface, and then the back rear corner goes in, and then that changes the game.
Yeah, it's possible. One of the pastimes when you're into biomechanics, unfortunately, is watching horrible injury mechanisms and really trying to understand how they work. So I've watched, probably like yourself, thousands and thousands of them across women, adolescents, men, football. And there's been studies now that have kind of tried to, almost put into silos each of those different injury mechanisms, whether you're pressing or defending or landing from a header. But you're so right. Time and time again, when you watch a video, it'll be someone in the air. There'll be a small shift to the ball will just slightly deflect off someone, or in research, you call them perturbations. Like there's a change to your movement while you're in the air that was unplanned, and then the landing kind of goes south. With those, I'm not sure how much of it's a part of it, but I'm not sure how much of a part it will play. I guess if you're, like we said, if you're bumping right on the top of that window, you've got a high friction surface, a high friction shoe, this probably isn't something that helps on top of all of that, because you've already got a lot to deal with. But it's probably not the major driver of it all, the movement error, the thing that happens. It probably is, isn't it? I mean, when you remember the amazing one where Ronaldo landed like that and just kind of somehow superhumanly brought himself back from that. I mean, he was in all of, I don't know if you've watched this one, there's one where he goes up for headers better and he lands on one leg, he goes into, knee valgus, knee inwards. He's basically got most of the positions that you would say this should be an ACL, and then somehow, almost like someone pulls some string above him, he just kind of brings himself back to but
he is superhuman.
I think he was then, that's for sure. Yeah,
but he is probably going away at a tangent slightly. About as far away physically in terms of training volume, training history, training quality, and probably unique natural physiology, as far away as the main cohort of female footballers up to 5 years ago. I think there's been a massive turnover and a redistribution of the demographic entering girls football.
Yeah.
But up to 5 years ago, there was a very specific look of a footballer. I'm going to get in trouble for sure.
No, but if ever there was a time when you could say, as a mechanism to return from that, in that case, that seemed to save him. that could have very much been a different scenario. So there's something in that, yeah.
So it's brilliant. We covered the tractor stuff, which is really the key of the conversation I wanted to have with you. Really, we had a little bit of a chat before we recorded about what we do with how we value the like 11 plus and the foundational movement stuff. And I think I would link the Ronaldo thing into that, in that he has the ability to produce more than 2 times his body weight of force. He has the ability to delve into that force extremely quickly, which I'm not sure either of those things are true about most footballers, and definitely not true in most female footballers. So the thing I would look at more than even the strength, which I find huge strength deficits across girls football, is that they're what we call in sports science, their RSI, their reactive strength index. The way I explain this to the girls is how quickly they can turn their muscle on when it's demanded from landing, or and the numbers, the normative data we have, 1.5, 1.8, whatever, I get with girls like 0.5, 0.4, and that's very common within girls, female footballers, and on one leg is very often different to the other, grossly different to the other as well. And my feeling would be we need to increase their force production capacity, their strength of all girls, particularly on one leg. But I believe the key to it is increasing their RSI on one leg or another, and then developing their experience of change of direction moments and external stimulus to that change of direction moment as well. But even if you practice those skills without the ability to turn that force on quick enough, you kind of lost that. So that Ronaldo thing was a great example of that.
And having, you've been involved in that, and then you've probably then, programmed in or tailored things to try and improve that capacity. Do you see it as something that changes relatively quickly? I'm sure everyone has, certain people can look at a barbell and, get stronger. Like, do you see that as something with the women players coming through now that they can improve really quickly because they've had a lower bar with it or haven't trained it much? Or are some people, it's going to be variation there, but it's not something that is, there's a kind of limit that you hit. Does it improve reasonably quickly in your experience? If
really quickly, really quickly. I think it's the lowest hanging fruit. Earlier ages, I think it's skill. I think it's a skill they practice and that they can develop really to delve into this strength that they already have, because they don't have it. So they've never practiced how to turn on that muscle fast. So it's a very quick progression. I largely can get them from a 5 over a 1 in probably 12 sessions, which in strength and conditioning world, that's fast. But then getting them up to what we would see as optimal, that's the hard bit. And that probably comes about through history of doing that, building up a volume of that practice. I don't know. Really but yeah, I think it's a really easy win, and one we aren't doing enough. And get them. We have a boingy day, and so once a week, at least once a week, they'll be boinging for their 30 minutes of S&C that they're doing.
Such an important component, isn't it? Like, and I think historically maybe people have kind of stayed away from it at times because, in certain maybe during season kind of periods or something, because they're concerned about injury, tendinopathies or ruptures or issues. But it's something that needs to be trained, isn't it? Like, it's something that needs to be sharpened regularly. Yeah.
So my feeling is that there is a neurological component, a significant neurological component, but then particularly when you go through adolescence, that there is, if you can tap into that time where you have all of those wonderful hormones flowing at a level that Lance Armstrong knows, but it's natural when you're in teenage years that you can structurally change the tissue quality in your tendons at that moment. That's going to last forever if you can get in on that time. So if you've got a 14-year-old daughter, I don't know, I'm being sexist by suggesting she might have done gymnastics at some point, but those girls that have done gymnastics, those boys that have done gymnastics, they've probably been through the organized child abuse, as I call it, of their hot takes of gymnastics, where they're doing 2,000-3,000 foot contacts, just pogos after pogo after pogo. They're probably doing way more than S&Cs would program in 5- and 6-year-olds. But boy, can they jump by the time they're 9. And I've always looked at it as maybe we were under programming, and maybe they're over programming, but there is definitely a sweet spot you need to find in between.
Absolutely.
And so if we can get them boinging on one leg in the right kind of boot on the right surface, I think that's a big advantage. Is there, can you, so this has been wonderful, and quickly, can you say from your experience, if you believe forget like the boys girls boots, because I'm not sure anybody knows for sure what that actually means, but can you your quick hot take on, does having the right boot for the right surface increase or decrease the risk of ACLs?
That's $1 million question, isn't it? I think it's something that can probably, if you like, contribute to or augment probably a storm of other factors. I mean, if you blow out, if you took a little drone shot above all the possible things that could lead to that moment, there's a lot of force involved in every cut that you do and everything, and why doesn't it happen on any of those and it happens on this one? I wish I could answer some of that, but if I would step back from that, we've done some research looking at running after ACL, getting back on the pitch in your boots after ACL, looked at some of the forces involved. And I think some pragmatic advice would be to definitely get that relationship right for as you return to the pitch after an ACL injury, because we certainly, God forbid, don't want to see more, or either on the other side or the involved side. So for me, that's what a lot of my research was about, was like, okay, well, when can we, without all of that other evidence that we really need until that happens, that big database one day of evidence, what could we say about what's pragmatic advice for this relationship? Well, I'd hate to have your foot stuck when you're doing on-field rehab, when there's nothing riding on it. You're doing some skill-based drills, some capacity stuff, some running, getting back used to your boots. So at that stage, absolutely recommend boots with lower rotational traction. So small studs, more of them, not long metal studs, So to answer your question quickly, in certain situations, it probably contributes, but certainly not all. But it is something.
It's not the main cause of the difference in, because I'm probably extrapolating from my experience that girls are less likely to have the right boot, not even the right boot, that's pejorative. They probably have had fewer boots in their career than the boys. So
that's probably right.
The chances of them finding the boot for the right surface, and the variety of surface changes more in girls football. So it's less likely they're going to have the appropriate boot for that surface.
I think that's fair to say.
That isn't a major driver. That isn't the major driver in that 2 to 8 times more likely to cause ACL risk.
No, I'd say that's a factor. And I think the reason, you and I are chatting about it now and people have so much interest in it is everyone's got an opinion on it. Everyone puts a pair of boots on and they don't know what they should or shouldn't use. They have an idea. They score 3 goals in one and that becomes the ones that they love. And then they get an injury in another and then they never wear those again. People have an opinion on it. So I think it's something to discuss, and mainly because it's modifiable. It's one of the few things, once it's game time and there's a surface there to play on, that you have a little bit of control over if there's a few options, So it's definitely worth having a conversation about. As always, there's more research needed, which kind of drives me a bit crazy. But if you step back and say, well, pragmatically, does it sound like a good idea? There is no bad trade-off to having a little less rotational traction. There is a trade-off for having less straight line traction. You'll slip over and you won't have the performance. So very quickly, when I was looking back through my PhD, we found a study from 1971 by Joseph Torg, this guy in New York, who is just a superstar of the sports medicine world. And they did a study with a high school football program, American football program, where first of all, he tracked all their injuries for 2 seasons, and they were playing in kind of like older school screw-in studs that were, the length is going in my head, but a little bit longer and very solid, almost looked like the boots that people started playing football in England in the, in the 1900s. They almost look like work boots. Then switched to what he called soccer studs or soccer cleats, and as they say in America, which were pretty much, if you have in your mind like an Adidas World Cup, the black, round, molded type looking, shorter. They were 9.5 millimeters instead of longer ones, but they were like kind of rubber. They have some give. So like a old style Puma King, old style Adidas World Cup, old style Tempo sort of thing. For the whole of the league, so they had the power to get all of them to switch. And there was a 70% reduction in severe knee injuries. So because of him, and there's a lot of, this was a big study, a lot of numbers. Because of that study, there's probably a generation of people that went to that school who had less knee replacements and less long-term OA in the knees and things. But I didn't get to watch the games. Maybe it was rubbish. Maybe everyone slipped over, So there's something to it in terms of getting this relationship right. But there's also just so many variables, including, is it raining? Is it not? Do we live in Spain with really warm season conditions and grass that's different? Do we, there's all of those things that just sit in this one little bit. And then we have the rest of it that you already know, what's your injury history before? What's your training load? What's all those other things. So it's really difficult research to do. When I was getting into my PhD, my dad's a farmer. He said, what are you going to look at? And I explained to him and he went, too many variables. Not going to find anything. I said, yeah.
And he was right.
He could have saved me 5 years.
Yeah. But that's the beauty of research these days. You can research into anything.
You can.
We need some more. Dude, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on. Is there any firstly, you need to make some kind of medium forum where people can have a look and get like cliff notes of your recommendations. That's a great idea for you. You could sell that for sure. Here's a little story of how to get the boot right for your kid. So do that. Secondly, is there anywhere people can get hold of you or look at your stuff more than get hold of you, because they're annoying when people contact you?
Yeah, no worries. On that first thing, we actually did a piece that's called "Hey Coach, Physio, Mum, Dad, Podiatrist, what's the perfect boot for me?" And part of that is a parent's perspective, like a kid's perspective. Part of that is for a women's player. And so it's in the Aspetar Journal. It's open access online. If you literally search for "Hey Coach, Mum, Dad, what's the best boot for me?" it'll come up, and it's got good figures and diagrams and stuff. But yeah, I should put that in another place as well, in a repository. In terms of, I'm still on Twitter watching how that goes. I know there's other options, but that's probably the best place at the moment. Yeah, Twitter is a place I'll still respond to a message if you need something.
Brilliant. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good to meet you. I'm not sure that waffling will help anything, but
Dude,
anyway,
that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. That was brilliant. That was like more than I was expecting. Honestly, I was expecting like 10 minutes of your detail, but like this is real usable stuff as well, away from just ACL.
See, when we did the studies with the foot cam stuff, the best part of that with me was I was doing the scans, was the couple of minutes I got to spend with each athlete having a chat